Mori is going to be the next JFashion that I do a history video about, but I don't know, I guess I've just been lazy. Hello friends, it's the Stitches, and for the last month I have been buried in JFashion history research, and what I've discovered in that month honestly really surprised me. I genuinely thought I would make that joke and then drop this video like 2 weeks later.
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
But the deeper I dove, the more I realized that there are actually a lot of misconceptions surrounding the styles that I'm going to cover today. Speaking of which, today we will be discussing the histories of Natural Kei, Mori Kei, Dolly Kei, and Cult Party Kei. And as you can probably tell, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. The first style we're going to talk about is Natural Kei. Natural Kei functions as the root that basically all of the rest of these styles are going to branch off of. We discussed this fashion briefly before in my Lolita fashion history, and in that video I shared the timeline that is usually passed around in English-speaking communities and is commonly believed to be true. But that's where we run into our first string of misconceptions. First of all, the timeline itself is just very wrong. It's usually believed that Natural Kei started as early as the 1960s. But that doesn't actually appear to be true. One of the best sources for finding actually accurate information about these styles is Forrest and T, or I don't know much, but I'm learning. And they're actually the ones who discovered that the term Natural Kei as we use it doesn't really exist in Japan. As it turns out, Natural Kei is not actually the name of the style that we use that term to describe in Western circles. In recent years, and I mean as recently as like 2017, people in Japan have adopted the term Natural Kei to refer to the trends of minimalist fashion done in natural fibers that's currently popular in mainstream Japanese fashion. And no offense to that style, but what about this? What is this called? In English-speaking JFashion forums, Natural Kei describes a style meant to resemble the idealized version of a person, usually female, who lives in a cottage house by the woods. It's clearly influenced by the American and European prairie revival or romantic fashion movement of the 60s and 70s. But like a cutesified version. Very Little Red Riding Hood, very Beatrix Potter. Often layered, but with a clean and not particularly bulky silhouette. Often you see natural fibers in natural colors, muted pastels, and other jewel and earth tones. Shoes for this style are practical, but also they're kind of pretty too. The accessories are pretty minimal for the most part. It's really more meant to blend into the outfit rather than stand out from the outfit. Usually natural hair and makeup will be used, but you can still play around with it. You can get away with a red bitten lip or a little bit of nose blush, heck, even some fake freckles. Again, it's very prairie girl off to traverse the meadows to deliver a love letter. We know that this style was real and that it was worn in Japan. It just wasn't called Natural Kei. At least not until it reached a Western audience in the early 2000s. However, there are other things that it might have been called instead. This particular fashion style was, if not outright invented by, then at least popularized by the brand Pink House. And looking through their back catalog, yeah, that's Natural Kei. Problem though, Pink House didn't open its doors until 1982, which again puts our initial timeline way off. One of the main designers of Pink House, Kaneko Isao, started designing clothing of a similar style in 1973, which theoretically could give us our starting point for Natural Kei fashion. It's not the 1960s, but close enough. Pink House was hugely popular and people flocked to their pieces, solidifying cutesy prairie fashion as popular. A trend, even. Now, obviously our timeline is still pre-social media and really pre-people having internet regularly, so all of this should be taken with a grain of salt. But in 2020, most Japanese outfit snaps that are done in the style of Natural Kei will usually be tagged with something like Pink House fashion or Kaneko fashion. It seems that at least in Japan, Natural Kei was primarily a style that was associated with one single brand, Pink House. Now, since we love to obsessively really categorize and subcategorize everything here in the West. We actually do have something called Pink House K. We've been referring to Pink House K for a while. However, we don't consider it the same thing as natural K here in the West for some reason, even though it seems pretty clear that they are, in fact, the same thing. Obviously, styles are going to evolve over time, and brands are going to evolve over time, and maybe there is a case to be said about how the Pink House fashion brand makes clothing that's different enough from what we call natural K in order to distinguish between the two of them, but that wouldn't have been true in the 80s when these terms were first getting used, and it also would not have been true in the early 2000s when we started calling Pink House fashion natural K. At the time, it would still be describing the same thing. I know I'm jumping around a lot, but circling back to Kaneko Isao, he continues to design for Pink House throughout the 80s, and in the 90s, he leaves to open up his own brand, Wonderful World, before eventually retiring in 2007. This is going to set us up for our next shift in trends. Wonderful World created more clothing in a similar style to Pink House. So now, there are multiple brands making clothes that cater to our desire to look like we just walked out of a fairy tale. And all bets were off. Things from there just started to evolve pretty quickly. According to Street Snap Trends and Google Analytics, it would appear that natural K has been on a steady decline pretty much ever since 2006. However, that doesn't mean that we stopped wanting to dress like fairy tale characters. Kind of just means that we started wearing more instead. Just a quick couple notes before we move on to Mori Kei, though. One other name that has been theorized to be the name that was originally used in Japan is Country K, suggesting that natural K was simply a mistranslation and that it was meant to be Country K instead. However, the words for natural and country in Japanese don't seem to be like that close to each other that it would make that kind of mistranslation an easy thing to do. And I honestly couldn't find any other concrete evidence suggesting this theory. I do like the name Country K though. Natural K was moderately popular, however it did not develop a lifestyle community, much in the way that many other JFashions like Lolita or Mori did. I did find some rumors that there were natural K meetups, but they did just seem to be rumors. I couldn't find any proof that there were natural K communities in Japan. So while it does appear that natural K really was just a fashion style that was inspired by one particular design style, that doesn't diminish how influential it was. A similar thing kind of happened with gunny sacks in the US. It was a short-lived trend that was really only associated with one particular brand, but it was still very, very influential, and we're still talking about it. Moving forward, I think it'll be pretty easy to see how natural K really did directly influence the creation of Mori fashion. In 2006, a Mixi user named Chaco created a community for a fashion style that she called Mori Girl. Mixi at the time was an invite-only social media website that's very similar to Facebook, wherein a community is similar to a forum in that it's a place where people can create posts for discussion as well as share images. Allegedly, according to statements made by Chaco, she created the community as a meeting place for people who wore what would become known as Mori, but at the time was just an unnamed style that people were already wearing. From the mouth of Chaco herself, she did not create Mori Kei. People were already wearing Mori Kei. She just gave a name to it. The reason she called it Mori Girl was because she received a comment on one of her selfies saying that she looked like she was from the forest, left by one of her friends. Mori meaning forest in Japan. Although it was originally called Mori Girl, the name was later changed to Mori Kei to be more inclusive to all members of all genders, because it's actually easy to make non-feminine outfits with Mori styling. There are plenty of masculine and even androgynous outfits to take inspiration from. Chaco also created a list of over 60 items that would serve to give a guideline for the fashion and lifestyle aspects of Mori Kei. It has been suggested that this is what officially separated Mori Kei from natural Kei, defining it as its own style. There were some popular brands such as Wonder Rocket, however, it wasn't very brand focused as a style, and there was a heavy emphasis on thrifted items as well as handmade clothing. If you're having trouble distinguishing natural Kei from Mori Kei, think of it this way. A person who wears natural Kei lives in a cabin by the forest. A person who wears Mori Kei is a fantastical forest spirit who lives in the forest. It's sort of like they're different characters in the same fantasy novel. Mori Kei outfits consist of lots of layers, lots of mixed textures, vintage elements, and natural fibers. Practical shoes like boots are a must, and accessories can be very minimal or they can even be very over the top, but they are always nature themed. Despite being a rather over the top style, it's still kept very natural in terms of hair and makeup colors. And in terms of the color palette, it's just neutral earth tones all around. The Mixie community remained the main hub for Mori Kei fashion in Japan for several years, reaching peak membership in 2009 with over 35,000 members. While Mori did catch on and surge in popularity quickly in Japan, it also fell out of popularity very quickly in Japan. And the original Mixie community unfortunately now no longer exists. And around 2013 to 2014, popular Japanese Mori Kei influencers would start deactivating their blogs, and street snaps that would include Mori Kei fashion saw a steep decline. However, while Mori Kei saw a drop in popularity in Japan in 2014, that's actually when it kind of peaks worldwide. This marks that it had reached a global audience, and the global audience loved it. Around this time, Mori Kei was making a big splash on places like Tumblr, finding an entirely new and incredibly passionate audience. And while Mori Kei has been on the decline in recent years, we did see a bit of a sharp spike in interest in the fashion in 2020, February 2020 to be exact. But I'm gonna circle around to that at the end of the video. While there are plenty of things worth mentioning about Mori Kei in 2020, and how it has developed specifically in the last couple years, notably becoming much less over the top and more casual, I first want to discuss some other popular styles that were born out of the resulting vintage inspired fashion craze. But first, we've already been chatting for quite a long time. This seems like a good time for a commercial break. Remember to stretch your back and drink some water. Have we stretched? Have we hydrated? Mori Kei was hugely popular and incredibly influential, even more so than natural Kei. After the popularity of Mori, combined with the popularity of other styles like classic Lolita, JFashions sees a new era of vintage-inspired fashions in the early 2000s and the 2010s. The main spot for purchasing vintage and secondhand items being the Koenji neighborhood in Shibuya. So it makes perfect sense that this would be where styles like Dolly Kei and Cult Party Kei would be developed. Let's start with Dolly Kei. Much like natural Kei, Dolly Kei is a style that's associated with one particular brand, that being the Grimoire shop. Grimoire is a vintage and secondhand clothing shop opened by, I'm gonna butcher this, I'm so sorry, Naoaki Tobe and Hitomi Nomura in 2008. Hitomi Nomura is a former Bunka University student, and while attending classes, they created a line of accessories called Dolly. This is where the name Dolly Kei appears to have come from. However, the shop staff don't use that term, and they don't accept it as a fashion style. They simply referred to the style of clothing that they carried as grimoire, or vintage fashion, sometimes even vintage Kei. Now, I'm sure most of you have been to secondhand clothing stores. Even nicer vintage consignment shops still tend to have a very thrift store, but a little better feeling to them. Not to insult thrift stores, that is where 90% of my clothing comes from. But there is a very warehouse-like feel to a place like Goodwill, and then you have places like the Union Gospel Mission thrift stores that are very crowded with things just kind of packed in everywhere and God music playing all the time. Grimoire said, we're not gonna do that. The key to Grimoire's success was its brand identity. The shop itself was heavily decorated to look like what can only be described as the walk-in closet of a witch in a Grimm Brothers fairy tale. All of the whimsy and fantasy elements are present and on full display, but the thing about the Grimm Brother tales is that they were very dark. And accordingly, Dolly Kei has a lot of darker elements as well. And I even include the witch in there because grimoire is a name for a type of book of magic. It's usually like a workbook for spells. The fashion style of Dolly Kei is similar to Mori in that it is sometimes heavily layered, although not always, and it uses lots of mixed textures. In fact, rich and heavy textures are one of the main staples of the style, it seems like. A key word that could be used to describe a Dolly Kei outfit is sumptuous. Unlike Mori, silhouettes do tend to be more defined though, with things like petticoats and corsets not exactly being uncommon. Bold patterns are frequently used, and there are also often sometimes Eastern European influences, not to mention occult imageries from various different secret societies. Similar to the Masons, but honestly there are so many of them. Shoe styles are often vintage inspired. Lots of heels, but also something like a rocking horseshoe wouldn't necessarily be out of place. Accessories can be vintage jewelry, it can be bones and taxidermy, it can be broken dolls. Accessories are really where one would play up the creepy aspects of Dolly Kei. Also, a lot of ceremonial colors for some reason. The color palette is heavy on the jewel tones, with some earth tones and muted pastels used occasionally, but also lots and lots of black and cream. The hair and makeup really can be anything, but I do see a lot of short bob hairstyles in this fashion. And I do see the makeup normally kept natural, but just maybe defining a few features. But again, like, there aren't really hard and fast rules. You can go all out if you want. In addition to Grimoire keeping a very defined aesthetic to their shop, their popularity was also aided by a strong online presence. They even ran a blog where they would regularly post staff outfit snaps. In store, for the physical store, Naoki Tobe would travel overseas pretty frequently, sometimes even as often as 2 or 3 times a month during the height of Grimoire's success, bringing back a couple thousand items every single time. According to brand interviews, only about 50% of these items would sell right away. So in order to clear out unpurchased inventory, the shop would run regular fairs that would involve some sort of fashion event combined with sales. As impractical and unsustainable a business model as it seems now, introducing a faster business model into the vintage clothing market generated a lot of excitement, and Grimoire became an instant success that immediately hit a worldwide audience. Unfortunately, Dolly Kei grew so fast that I'm not sure that Grimoire was able to keep up with it. Google Analytics show a peak in worldwide interest in 2011, so it doesn't surprise me that in 2012, Grimoire decided to expand, opening Grimoire Almadel. In the same year, Grimoire launched Verum, which produced fast fashion items like printed tights and phone cases. The printed tights actually were quite popular. In fact, I still hear people talk about them to this day. However, this overall move did kind of spell doom for Dolly Kei. Naoki Tobe stated that he wanted to blend the worlds of fast fashion and vintage shopping together and believed that they could exist side by side. And the very next year, in 2013, is when Dolly Kei started to see its decline. Now, I don't know if the statements about fast fashion had anything to do with the decline in Dolly Kei. Honestly, I think it was really more of like a combination of different variables rather than any one single thing that did it. It is possible that something like Mori happened with Dolly Kei in that as it was peaking internationally, it was starting to lose interest in Japan. So Verum, which was something that could be purchased online from overseas, may have been the answer to keeping international interest, while opening Almadel to cushion the losses from any unsold vintage products. However, that's just kind of a hypothesis that I have no support for. Another brand that I will get to later is actually located right across the street from a high school. And that was really interesting to me. So I kind of opened up the map and zoomed out a little bit, and I realized that the Koenji area actually has a lot of schools in the area. Now, I'm not saying that setting up shop next to a high school or a college is going to guarantee a trendy teen audience, but it is going to increase the likelihood that that's your main clientele. And the teen market is famously unpredictable. Teens pick up stuff and like it and make it famous overnight, and they also start disliking stuff and drop it and cancel it overnight. And that particular consumer demographic just happens to be one of the hardest ones to get the attention of and keep the attention of. So as I stated, there are so many factors at play in this particular situation. It could possibly just be a simple case of brand makes it big with a young audience. Brand grows and threatens to become more mainstream. Brand makes some different business decisions, and then the young audience stops being able to relate. This has happened so many times with so many brands, so many different styles, like it's practically a cliche. Grimoire is actually still in business, however they have changed their products to fit in with a more mainstream clientele. Since we no longer have the Grimoire blog to pump out outfit snaps that look like this, The style is considered dead, essentially. I've mentioned in the past that several fashion styles are dead. It's unfortunately just what happens to fashion styles. They stop growing, they stop evolving, they dip a little bit in popularity, and they become dead fashions. That doesn't mean that people stopped wearing them, though. Just because there's lowered interest in it, just because it's not super trendy anymore, doesn't mean that there isn't a community of people that love it. I mean, Lolita is technically a dead fashion. Goth is technically a dead fashion. Punk is famously a dead fashion. Like I said, it's not that there aren't people wearing them, it's not that they aren't, potentially popular styles. They're just not growing or changing or evolving, and therefore they're just kind of what they are. Now, Dolly Kei is said to have a sister style that is also heavily influenced by Mori trends, and that sister style is considered Cult Party Kei. I have heard so many rumors that Cult Party Kei and Dolly Kei are sister styles, and that Cult Party and Grimoire were sister stores. Like, everyone on Tumblr in 2012 was like, they're related, they're related, they're related. Meanwhile, Cult Party is sitting here like, I don't know her. Cult Party Kei and Dolly Kei both come from shops that were located in the Koenji area of Shibuya, but that is the only connection I was able to make between the two of them. And with all of the information that's available about Grimoire, if it was connected to Cult Party, we would know about it. We would probably have confirmation of it, but there just isn't. There has never been anything to suggest that they are related stores in any way other than the fact that they came out of the same neighborhood. And as I already mentioned, this neighborhood is home of many secondhand clothing and vintage stores. So as you may have already guessed, Cult Party is a fashion style that is associated with one particular brand, this time being Cult Party. Unfortunately, the person who ran Cult Party describes themselves as an analog type person. And Cult Party actually never had any sort of online presence. There was no website and no real social media available for anything that Cult Party really did, which makes researching that particular era of the shop's history very, very difficult. But sometime in 2010, which would have been prior to the style's height in popularity, Cult Party closes its doors, does some restructuring, and reopens as the Virgin Mary. This time with an aesthetic homepage and a blog complete with staff outfit snaps. It seems that they noticed all of the other success that every other brand who had some sort of blog was having at the time. But that was just kind of the reality of the situation. In 2010, every brand needed to have a blog, and now in 2020, it's an Instagram. However, despite the name change of the store, the style remained Cult Party Kei. But unlike Natural Kei, unlike Dolly Kei, the creators of the Virgin Mary actually did use the term Cult Party to describe their style. They didn't really use the term in their promotional material, but they also didn't come out and ask people to stop using it either. The Cult Party Kei community remained informal, never really setting strict rules for the fashion. But like Grimoire, the Virgin Mary shop did host several social events. They would do gallery events and student shows and other fashion events as a way of maintaining the social aspect and drawing in more customers. This helped the style spread and gain more popularity as well, showing a Google search interest peak in roughly 2013 to 2014. Despite being considered a sister style to Dolly Kei, the fashion style of Cult Party Kei is not similar to Grimoire at all. Outfits consist of a white base piled with layer upon fluffy layer to the point where we don't even have like a discernible silhouette anymore. You're just a marshmallow blob and you're living your life. Pastel colors are also mixed in, as well as cutesy, crafty little handmade items. In addition to true vintage items from all eras, Victorian to Y2K, the Virgin Mary also carried pieces from student designers, which makes sense given their proximity to students. They were the ones that had that location right across from a high school. Shoes for Cult Party Kei are varied, but they are usually some sort of platform. The accessories are where the more kawaii aspects of the style really shine. Stuffed animals, anime merch, toys, dolls, especially if you made it yourself, and even better if it looks a little bit off. Imperfection is actually a very common theme within Cult Party Kei. Soft colors for hair and makeup are preferred, but it really is anything goes. However, high blush right on top of the cheek, like on top of the cheekbone, in between the cheekbone and your eye, in the under eye area, is almost always present. And there is one other thing. I'm sure you've already noticed, but every outfit, every single one, has some sort of red cross somewhere on it. Many of the outfits also oddly seem to include, like, themes revolving around safety reminders. I don't think that the red cross is meant to symbolize anything specific. At least I couldn't find anything it was meant to symbolize in my research. And in fact, it doesn't even seem to be like a necessary thing that you're supposed to have in Cult Party Kei. It's pointed out over and over again in Western sources, but I haven't seen any Japanese source that specifically says, yes, you need to wear a red cross, or else it's not Cult Party Kei. Like, it seems like outfits that don't include it are still accepted as Cult Party Kei, so it doesn't seem to be like an important aspect. It's just iconic, I guess. But it is practically always there. At some point, there are staff changes in the Virgin Mary shop, and the blog and web presence fall off, with the domain for the website completely expiring in 2016. And this marks the beginning of Cult Party Kei's decline. Like Grimoire, the Virgin Mary is still in business today. However, they have changed their brand style to cater to a more mainstream audience. Part of me almost wants to do a video about why brands decide to go mainstream, because there is a reason for it. Usually it's just so that they can stay in business after their brand style becomes less trendy, but I don't know, I kind of want to explore that more. And that brings us to the end of the major points concerning the fashion styles that I wanted to share with you today. But there is that one thing that I was gonna circle back to about Mori Kei. And also, as my favorite YouTuber MePearlA would say,
there's an elephant in the room.
Earlier this year, we experienced the rise of a phenomenon called Cottage Core. In fact, Cottage Core started what would be the beginning of a very long and sharp peak, right at the very beginning of 2020. Right around the same time that our Mori Kei peak happened in February 2020.
Huh. How about that?
So what is Cottage Core? I'm sure you've already seen so much discussion about Cottage Core that you don't really need me to rehash it. So I won't get too deep into it, but it was one of the many aesthetics that was born out of the Tumblr aesthetic cores community. There were things like Love Core and Angel Core, Rainbow Core, and of course, the iconic Goblin Core. But there was also Cottage Core. Wait. Wasn't Mori popularized in the West by Tumblr? Let's take a detour. Let's talk about 2020. It's been a shit year. 2019, also a shit year. You know what's been happening. You know what's going on out there. Don't you sometimes wish you could just run away? I know sometimes I definitely read a headline and I think,
man, I really wish I lived in a cottage in the woods right now.
those same feelings might lead one to return to the old Tumblr, dust off the Mori Kei tag. And while you're there, maybe discover another underground aesthetic that feeds into all of those same desires that Mori Kei had to run away into the forest and just not do anything. Forget about all this shit. Return to a simpler way of life. A simpler time. But, the idealized version, where it's all Peter Rabbit and no slavery. So while cottagecore isn't directly related to Mori Kei, I do feel like they're a little bit correlated. Both aesthetics were born out of the same desires to go live in a hut by the woods. So when all of this stuff started happening, the same people that Mori appealed to also found cottagecore, and eventually took it off of Tumblr and onto TikTok, where it exploded. And now I think that the cottagecore trend really can live alongside Mori Kei. Mori Kei actually does slip into cottagecore quite easily, whereas cottagecore is really more of a visual aesthetic, a lifestyle aesthetic. It's not strictly a fashion style, whereas Mori kind of is, although it does have lifestyle aspects. So I think that the two can live side by side. You can be living your cottagecore Mori Kei dreams. And with that, that's all I have for today. I hope everyone has a good day, and I will see you all next time. Bye!